You think you could survive a single day in World War II? Just 24 hours, boots on the ground, rifle in your hands, marching with the soldiers whose lives hung on every breath? The truth is harsher than you imagine. It wasn't just bullets or bombs that ended men's lives. It was the hunger gnawing at their stomachs, the thirst from empty canteens, the cold that froze them to their very bones, the endless mud, the rats chewing at their boots, the lice crawling through every seam of their clothes, the sleepless nights under flares and shellfire, the silence so heavy it drove men to the edge of madness. Soldiers learned to share scraps of bread like sacred treasure, to whisper stories of home just to stay sane, to invent rituals that kept despair away. Courage alone was never enough. It was about endurance, loyalty, and sacrifice in the smallest, most exhausting ways. Tonight, you'll discover why you wouldn't last even one full day in that world, and yet, why those who did endure left behind lessons that still echo in us. You probably imagine you could survive a single day in World War II. That 24 hours in uniform would simply mean carrying a rifle, staying alert, and waiting for orders. But the reality is stranger and heavier than most people can picture. And tonight, as you lie back in your bed, the light soft in your room and the outside world quieted by nightfall, I invite you to let your imagination walk into a history that rarely gets told this way, not with shouts and explosions, but with the slow pulse of lived detail, with the textures of exhaustion and the hidden moments that decide whether you would last until morning. Perhaps as you listen, you are wrapped in a blanket. Maybe there is the faint sound of rain against your window, or a hum of a late-night street outside, and you can let those sounds merge with the images I'll paint, because this is a story meant to calm you even as it unsettles, to show you that 24 hours in World War II was not just a test of courage, but of breath, patience, and the strange little rituals soldiers used to stay human in a world designed to strip that away. So before we step into the mud and the frost, subscribe to our channel, because each night we bring you another piece of sleeping history, fragments of the past retold in quiet voices, so you can drift into dreams with knowledge as your companion. And while you are here, tell us in the comments where you're listening from, whether it is a dorm room in Karachi, an apartment in New York, a farmhouse in Punjab, or a quiet flat in Berlin, because those places are connected tonight through this shared act of remembering. Now close your eyes if you like, because our scene begins not with a grand invasion, but with the small, cruel discomforts that start the clock on survival. Imagine the cold, not the simple cold of winter mornings you've known, but the kind that seeps into your bones before dawn, when your blanket is a rough wool army issue, already damp from condensation, and your breath fogs in the half-light of a barracks that smells of mildew, unwashed uniforms, and the metallic tang of gun oil, a smell that will cling to you even in your dreams. The whistle blows not for breakfast, but for roll call, and you stumble out, boots already heavy with yesterday's mud, socks stiff with dried sweat, stomach empty because rations are thin, and there is no steaming plate of comfort, only a tin mug of bitter coffee substitute or watery broth, sometimes black bread so hard you could hammer a nail with it. And this is the first truth of why you might not last. The body begins failing not in battle, but in boredom, in hunger, in the erosion of warmth. Imagine trudging to your post as the sky lightens, carrying a rifle that weighs not much in theory, but feels like a stone when you know you must never set it down, not even when you want to scratch your nose or rub your tired eyes, because the weapon is your extension, your ticket to survival, and your curse. Every step is punctuated by thoughts of home, of the bed you left behind, of meals once taken for granted. And yet you must silence those thoughts, or they will slow you. And slowness can be death, for orders come suddenly and without kindness, sending you to dig trenches with frozen fingers, or to march until your toes blister and bleed inside those stiff boots. And still, the strangest detail is how ordinary the hours feel. How the war is less often explosions and more often waiting. Endless waiting with tension, wrapped tight as wire in your chest. Waiting in mud, waiting in snow, waiting in a foxhole, so cramped you cannot stretch your legs. Listening to the dripping of water, to the scuttling of rats that grow fat on crumbs, and even on the dead. For yes, in many places the rats were not small, but monstrous. Bold enough to crawl over sleeping men, gnaw at leather straps, or steal food right from your pack. And no amount of courage steels you against the shiver of waking in darkness, with a whiskered muzzle against your cheek. 24 hours is long when each minute holds such strange intrusions. When you cannot close your eyes without fear that enemy artillery will choose that exact second to shatter the sky above you. And yet exhaustion demands its price, so men learn to sleep in fragments, heads resting on helmets, backs against mud walls, one eye half open, a rhythm that keeps you alive but leaves your mind frayed, unraveling thread by thread. In these hours, humor becomes strange, brittle, but necessary. And perhaps you would not expect that men joked about the lice crawling through their seams, naming them after generals or old girlfriends, laughing softly as they scratched, because without such laughter, the itching became unbearable madness. And this too is why you might not last, for you have never had to fight an invisible enemy that lives in your clothes, multiplying, biting, leaving red constellations across your skin, reminding you that even stillness is a battleground. By midday, if you have not collapsed from fatigue, you are sent on errands that sound simple: carry ammunition boxes, fetch water, clean latrines, but each is a trial. Because water may be frozen solid, and to fetch it, you may need to chip ice from a shell hole with numb fingers. Ammunition weighs like bricks and must be dragged through sucking mud that swallows boots whole. And latrines are pits buzzing with flies in summer, or frozen into grotesque sculptures in winter. Places where dignity vanishes and men learn to joke or they break. The day drags on, and the historical truth emerges gently as a lullaby. That World War II was not a movie of constant firefights, but a grind of discomforts punctuated by sudden terrors. And survival depended less on heroism than on sheer endurance, on adapting to environments that wanted to unmake you. Perhaps you would last through the afternoon. Perhaps you would even find yourself marveling at small beauties, the glint of sun on barbed wire, the rare kindness of a fellow soldier sharing a cigarette stub, the way smoke curled into the frosty air like a signal to the heavens. But evening comes, and with it a deeper challenge, for now fear takes a new shape. The long night ahead, the patrols through woods where every branch might conceal an ambush, the hours of lying prone in no man's land, listening to distant engines, the sky above alive with searchlights that sweep like the gaze of watchful gods. And even if you survive the cold, the hunger, the vermin, and the fear, you may not survive the silence, for silence in war is not peace, it is suspense. It is the intake of breath before something strikes, and you live inside that intake, never exhaling fully, never unclenching. This is why you would not last 24 hours. Not because you are weak, but because the clock itself conspires against you, turning ordinary human needs into weapons. The need to sleep, the need to eat, the need to be warm, the need to laugh, the need to feel safe. Every one of those needs is denied, everyone pressed until it breaks you down. And if you do last until dawn, you are not the same as you were. You are hollowed, changed, a ghost carrying a rifle through mud, waiting for another hour to tick. But for now, as you lie in your bed, perhaps your eyelids heavier than when we began, let this imagined day soften into dream, and let the curiosity of what comes next, the strange detail of how soldiers tricked their minds into surviving. Another hour. Pull you gently toward next story part. The hours after dawn stretch long and strange. And if you thought the first night was unbearable, the second morning reveals an even deeper truth about why you might not last, for the body is not designed for such unrelenting strain, and when the sun climbs behind a pale veil of cloud, it illuminates not glory, but the quiet collapse of men forced to repeat the same tasks without end. Their shoulders bent under rifles that seem heavier now than when they were issued, their eyes red-rimmed and hollow, their lips cracked by frost or dry wind, and you realize survival here is measured not in victories, but in how many tiny degradations you can endure without breaking. Whether it is the stale crust of bread that tastes of sawdust, or the can of meat that smells faintly rancid, but must be eaten anyway, or the way your skin sticks to damp wool that never dries, turning every movement into a scrape of discomfort. And still, the war does not roar constantly. It whispers, and that is worse. For in the silence, you begin to hear too much. The creak of boots in mud, the cough of a man 2 paces away, the distant thud of artillery that may or may not come closer, the eerie quiet before a sudden shell lands, tearing apart earth and bodies alike, and leaving behind a ringing in your ears that blends with the groans of the wounded. Imagine crouching low in a shallow trench, soil crumbling beneath your fingers, the air thick with smoke, and the acrid bite of gunpowder, your heart hammering not in rhythm, but in stutters, because you do not know if the next explosion will choose you, and every second stretches like taffy, long, unbearable, until you forget what normal time ever felt like. And yet, in this surreal distortion, small acts of humanity emerge. Someone presses a half-cigarette into your palm. Another mutters a joke about the officer's mustache, and laughter ripples softly through cracked lips. Laughter that is as fragile as glass, but enough to keep despair from winning entirely. And then there are the strange, almost unbelievable details, the ones rarely written in textbooks, but whispered by veterans decades later, that sometimes men carried lucky charms not from home, but scavenged from battlefields, a scrap of enemy uniform, a dented coin, a button, objects infused with superstition, clutched like talismans against randomness, as though the universe might be persuaded by tokens to spare them for another day. But luck is fickle, and in the afternoon you are ordered to move again, your pack digging into your shoulders, your rifle clanging against your hip, the road ahead long and littered with shattered helmets, splintered wagons, abandoned boots half buried. In the muck, silent reminders that someone else did not last their 24 hours, and you walk past them because you must, though their presence gnaws at your mind. Hunger sharpens by midday into a twisting pain, and when you are handed a bowl of watery stew, you drink it greedily, ignoring the grit between your teeth, the way the broth tastes faintly of rust, and you think of kitchens back home, of bread, soft from the oven, of fruit sweet on the tongue, of meals eaten without fear of interruption, and the memory alone is almost painful. And here lies another reason survival feels impossible. The war erases softness, replaces it with edges, rough textures, harsh tastes, and the longer you endure them, the more you forget that softness ever existed, until your dreams are not of embraces or laughter, but of silence. A silence without artillery, a silence where you can hear your own breath and believe you will still hear it tomorrow. But the war does not grant such silence, for even when the sky is clear, danger prowls, snipers hidden in barns, mines buried along roadsides, planes droning above like hungry insects, and each moment of stillness could at any second ignite into chaos, making the act of simply walking, simply existing, a gamble. By late afternoon, fatigue has become not just physical but mental, a fog rolling through your mind, slowing thought, blurring vision, and you stumble not from wounds but from weariness, the sort of weariness that makes you forget your own name. For a moment, forget the date, forget what normal feels like, until you are simply a moving shadow, propelled forward by orders shouted in clipped tones. And you obey, because choice is a luxury long lost. In the quieter moments, soldiers spoke in half-whispers about home, about girls they once loved, about towns they could no longer picture clearly, and often they argued about food, of all things, debating the best soup or the finest bread as though the argument itself were a feast. And these conversations became as vital as weapons because words could distract the mind from the gnawing in the belly, from the terror in the distance. And sometimes, humor turned darker. Men joked about their own deaths, about the absurdity of marching endlessly, only to fall in a ditch no one would remember. And the laughter that followed was not light, but sharp, brittle, edged with despair, yet even that brittle laughter kept something alive. But as evening shadows lengthen, another ordeal begins. For nights in World War II were not for rest, but for patrols, for guard duty, for lying still in freezing mud, ears straining for the crunch of enemy boots, eyes scanning horizons where every tree could be a figure, every shadow a threat, and this constant vigilance grinds the soul as surely as hunger gnaws the body. Try to imagine lying flat in a shallow depression in the ground, the stars bright above but offering no comfort, the earth beneath you damp and cold, your fingers numb around your rifle, your breath clouding in front of your face, and the silence pressing so heavily you almost beg for noise, because at least noise would mean certainty, would mean the waiting is over. And here again, you see why lasting 24 hours is not a simple task. Because war demands you live inside uncertainty, stretched thin between terror and boredom, until your own thoughts become enemies, whispering doubts, replaying sounds, inventing dangers. And when a flare suddenly bursts overhead, lighting the landscape in harsh white brilliance, your heart seizes, your body tenses, every nerve on fire, and for a moment, time halts. And you realize survival is not just about avoiding bullets, but about enduring this endless cycle of anticipation and release, this whiplash between silence and shattering. And by the time the long night deepens, your mind is fractured, held together by the thinnest threads of willpower. And you begin to understand lasting one more hour, much less 24, is an act not of strength, but of surrender, to the rhythm of exhaustion, hunger, fear, and fragile camaraderie. And it is this surrender that allows some to survive while others falter, a truth both haunting and strangely calming. As you drift now towards sleep with the curiosity of what strange rituals, what hidden details, what unseen forces kept soldiers alive into the next day, details that wait quietly for you in next part. The third stretch of your imagined 24 hours begins not with battle, but with the strange quiet that settles in just before dawn. That liminal hour when night has not fully released its grip and day has not yet claimed the sky. And if you thought fatigue was already unbearable, this is the moment it takes its truest form. A weight pressing so heavily on your eyelids that every blink feels like surrender. Yet you cannot close them fully because you are still expected to watch, to listen, to stand guard against an enemy that may or may not come. And it is here that the greatest test begins, because this war was not simply about courage or strength, but about resisting the betrayal of your own body, which craves sleep more than safety, rest more than vigilance, and men discovered cruel tricks to keep themselves awake, biting their tongues until they bled, rubbing snow against their faces until their skin burned, whispering nonsense to themselves, humming tunes from home, anything to resist the seductive pull of oblivion, for to drift off could mean never waking again. As the horizon begins to gray and birds stir faintly, you think you might find relief in the light. But daylight in the war only exposes new truths, for it reveals the ruin around you, the mangled trees shredded by artillery, the ground pockmarked with craters, the blackened ruins of farmhouses, the broken carts, the horses lying stiff in fields, and the half-buried helmets that mark where lives ended abruptly. And walking past such reminders does not make you stronger. It hollows you out, each step feeling heavier with the knowledge that you are breathing in air once inhaled by men now gone. The breakfast, if it can be called that, offers little comfort. Perhaps a thin slice of bread, maybe a smear of margarine, or coffee substitute so bitter it makes you wince. And you choke it down not because it satisfies, but because your body needs fuel, however meager, to carry you through another punishing cycle. And here comes another peculiar detail, the kind of history not often told. Many soldiers, in absence of proper food, resorted to chewing raw grains, gnawing on sugar beets, or even boiling weeds and grass, just to trick their stomachs into believing it had been fed. And though these improvisations brought no nourishment, they carried the fragile hope of survival. And hope, even false, can be as sustaining as bread. By mid-morning, the monotony of waiting returns, broken only by the strange rhythm of chores, cleaning weapons, repairing boots with bits of wire, digging new trenches, hauling supplies, tasks that seem endless and meaningless, but keep hands busy. And men clung to these routines because routine was sanity, and sanity was the only shield against despair. You begin to notice how even humor has shifted, no longer light but biting. Soldiers mocking their officers in whispers, laughing at the absurdity of washing socks in icy water that freezes stiff within minutes, telling stories of lice with personalities, inventing conversations between fleas, anything to make the infestation feel less dehumanizing. And this laughter, strange and thin, was an act of rebellion, proof that even in mud and misery, they still owned fragments of themselves. And yet, despair seeped in through unexpected cracks in the shape of letters from home that sometimes arrived after weeks of silence. Paper crumpled, words smudged, the handwriting of loved ones stirring both joy and agony, for to be reminded of softness, of love, of warmth, was to feel how far you had drifted from it. And men wept quietly into their sleeves, their sobs muffled by the sound of distant artillery, because to be vulnerable in front of others was risky, a breach of the hard mask that survival demanded. Then comes the march again, boots slapping against frozen earth, packs biting into shoulders, rifles digging into palms, and the road stretching endlessly under a pale sky, each step echoing in the mind until walking becomes not movement, but trance. And you wonder if you could endure such trances, hour upon hour, when your only company is the ache in your muscles and the occasional bark of an officer reminding you to keep pace. Along the way you see sights that etch themselves into memory. A barn splintered into matchsticks by bombs, fields once golden now charred black, the eerie silence of villages emptied of people, doors hanging open, windows shattered, pots still, sitting on stoves as though the owners might return any moment, though they never will. And these ghost villages whisper louder than artillery, reminding you that war does not only kill bodies, but empties entire lives, entire communities. The afternoon stretches into another test, as hunger gnaws and water becomes scarce, and soldiers often risked drinking from puddles, from shell craters, from streams fouled by corpses, their desperation greater than their fear of disease. And dysentery, typhus, cholera crept quietly into the ranks, felling men not with bullets, but with fevers, cramps, and weakness, so profound they could not rise from the ground. And here lies another truth. You might not last 24 hours, because survival required not only dodging shells, but enduring sickness without medicine, vomiting into the mud while still expected to march, shivering with fever while still expected to hold a rifle. And still, night approaches again, and you brace yourself for another long watch, another round of whispers and shadows, another flare, illuminating the world in harsh bursts. And you realize that even if you reach the end of this imagined day, you are no longer the person who began it, because the war has reshaped you into something else, something harder and hollower, and yet strangely more fragile. Perhaps the strangest thing of all is how soldiers found ways to mark time in this endless repetition, scratching lines into helmets, carving initials into wooden posts, saving cigarette butts in neat piles, as though small acts of counting could create order in chaos. And these little rituals kept men tethered to the idea of continuity, to the belief that there would be another day to count, another hour to scratch, another breath to take. And now, as you lie in your safe bed, perhaps half asleep already, you see why 24 hours in World War II was not survivable in the way most imagine. For it was not just the enemy's bullets, but the 1,000 small wounds of fatigue, hunger, cold, fear, silence, and waiting that conspired against you. And if you wonder how anyone endured beyond it, let that curiosity guide you softly into Part 4, with the secrets of endurance, the hidden ways men trick themselves into surviving. Another day will quietly unfold. The fourth movement of this imagined day begins with the realization that the body has limits you cannot bargain with. And yet, in World War II, those limits were pushed past breaking until survival itself became a strange science of improvisation. Endurance measured not in victories, but in the ability to carve out fragments of normalcy from abnormal conditions. And as the second night stretches behind you, the morning does not feel like relief, but like another trick of time, a gray dawn, seeping across a landscape torn by shells, trees reduced to jagged stumps, the earth scarred into furrows that look less like fields and more like wounds. And you rise from the mud with joints stiff, skin crawling with lice, throat raw from breathing smoke and frost, and the smell around you, an unforgettable mixture of sweat, gun oil, damp wool, and the faint sweetness of decay that no one speaks of, yet everyone notices. This is where you see how soldiers bent reality to survive, inventing rituals that made unbearable things just slightly bearable, like taking 5 minutes to polish boots that would be muddy again within the hour, or folding a blanket with mathematical precision, even though it was wet and filthy, or memorizing poems and song lyrics whispered over and over under the breath, as though words could shield the mind against chaos. And perhaps you too would find comfort in such habits, but you might also find them maddening, because the repetition is endless and the pointlessness presses heavily, like carrying water in a cracked bucket you know will never be full. By mid-morning you are reminded that the war was not just fought by soldiers, but by the environment itself. Mud becoming a weapon, snow a prison, rain an enemy that soaked uniforms and turned trenches into brown rivers where men stood knee-deep, until their skin blistered and peeled, a condition they called trench foot, where toes turned purple and rotted in boots that could not be removed without tearing flesh. And you realize how lasting 24 hours was already a miracle, for infection lurked in every blister, in every cut from barbed wire, in every spoonful of unsafe water, and antibiotics were not yet widely available, so fever and gangrene claimed more than bullets. And yet, amidst this cruelty, soldiers found moments of absurd humor. One might sing opera in a ruined farmhouse, his voice echoing against broken beams. Another might carve chess pieces out of wood scraps and play on a board scratched into the dirt, and others might swap outlandish rumors, stories of secret weapons or miraculous rescues, tales half believed because belief itself was necessary fuel. Then there were the rituals of superstition, men refusing to shave on certain days, carrying photographs of movie stars as though they were guardian spirits, tying strings around wrists, refusing to step on cracks in frozen mud, each gesture a negotiation with fate. And though these details seem small, they reveal how survival was less about guns than about the fragile architecture of the mind. By midday, exhaustion presses again, and soldiers learn to sleep in fragments, 5 minutes leaning against a wall, 10 minutes curled in a corner, sometimes even standing with rifles cradled, their bodies training themselves to drift into half-sleep where dreams blurred with reality, with a sound of artillery blended with imagined thunder. And here lies another reason you might not last, because your modern body is not accustomed to such fractured rest, to never sinking fully into dream, but always hovering at the edge, always ready to snap awake, and over hours and days, his half-sleep unravels sanity, pulling threads of memory and perception until hallucinations creep in, until shadows move that should not move, until you hear voices that are not there. And still, duty calls, and you are sent to carry crates of ammunition, each box heavy enough to bow your spine, each step sinking into mud that grips like hands. And as you stagger forward, you realize the absurdity, that the weight of metal you carry may never be fired, may be destroyed in the next barrage. Yet your aching muscles and strained breath are demanded anyway, for war does not care about efficiency, it only consumes. Along the road you pass corpses not yet buried, their faces pale, their hands stiff, and though you try not to look, you cannot help but notice that some are young, so young that the war has etched lines into faces that should still be soft with. Youth, and this sight imprints itself onto your thoughts, returning when you close your eyes, a ghost lodged in your mind. But there are also living faces, comrades beside you, and it is their presence that sometimes saves you. Someone cracks a joke about the food, another sings softly, another shares a piece of chocolate saved for weeks, and in these moments, the heaviness lifts slightly, and you realize that endurance is not solitary, but collective, that men survived less by strength than by holding each other's despair like a secret no one else could see. Afternoon stretches, and you are ordered to dig, always digging, shovels biting into soil already churned, your hands blistered, your back aching, and yet the trench must be deeper, the walls reinforced, the earth piled high, and you dig knowing full well that tomorrow another shell may undo all this labor. But you dig anyway, because labor itself is what keeps terror at bay, because a moving body cannot collapse as easily as an idle one. And yet, fear creeps in at dusk, when shadows lengthen and the sounds change, when the calls of birds give way to silence, when even the wind seems to hush as though waiting, and you huddle in your coat, rifle close, listening for the crunch of footsteps, for the mechanical cough of engines, for anything that might mean the enemy is stirring. The night begins, and with it, another ritual of vigilant sentinels posted at intervals, each man straining against sleep, staring into the blackness where imagination invents phantoms, every bush a soldier, every flicker of light a signal. And in that silence, your mind plays tricks, recalling voices of family, hearing whispers that cannot be real, feeling the brush of insects against skin, magnified into the certainty of hands. And this is where many men broke, not in firefights, but in quiet hours, unable to bear the endless pressure of waiting for something that may not come. And when it does come, when the night is ripped open by flares and gunfire, the shock is so violent it almost feels like relief, because finally the tension has somewhere to go. Finally the fear can run its course, and you hurl yourself into the mud, ears ringing, heart hammering, mouth dry, and in the flashes of light you see chaos men shouting, bodies falling, earth exploding, and yet you keep moving, because movement is all that remains. And when the barrage passes, silence returns sharper than before, and you are left trembling, shivering not just from cold, but from the realization that you have survived another moment, but are less certain than ever you can survive another hour. And this, perhaps, is the cruelest part of the 24 hours. That survival is never a victory, but only a postponement, that every breath borrowed feels like debt, and you lie there in the dark, wondering if your endurance will stretch one more day, as the curiosity of how men found the strength to keep stretching it, how they stitched fragments of humanity into the torn fabric of war, invites you softly toward. By the time you reach what feels like the fifth great movement of this endless day, you begin to understand that war erodes the concept of hours altogether. But the clock no longer marks neat boundaries between morning and afternoon, but instead drags you through cycles of hunger, fear, exhaustion, and brief moments of relief, stitched together like a frayed quilt barely holding warmth. And if you thought that surviving until this point would mean you had adapted, the reality is stranger. Adaptation in war does not mean comfort. It means numbing, a gradual surrender to conditions that once would have horrified you, but now become ordinary. Ordinary. Like drinking water with a film of oil on top, or brushing lice from your collar as casually as you might brush dandruff, or ignoring the groans of a man nearby because your own body has become a prison demanding constant attention. The morning air is damp, filled with the scent of churned earth and faint smoke, and you trudge again, boots heavy, uniform stiff with dried mud, eyes half closed from fractured rest, and you see the truth written on every face around you. Hollow. Cheeks, unshaven jaws, lips cracked and bleeding, eyes that dart quickly at shadows, yet linger wearily on the ground, as though the earth itself has become their only certainty. Rations come in tins dented and greasy, sometimes holding meat so salty it burns your tongue, sometimes only a few biscuits that crumble to dust. And soldiers devised rituals even in this, using can lids as makeshift spoons, trading morsels like currency, laughing grimly about whose meal tasted most like shoe leather. And this humor, small and strange, kept despair from fully swallowing them. But not all details were humorous. Some were grotesque in ways too quiet to dramatize. Men who had not removed their boots for days discovered their feet swollen, skin peeling in white layers, toenails black and curling, and they pushed through. Because stopping meant falling behind, and falling behind meant disappearing. And you imagine whether your body could endure such neglect, whether your will could force legs forward when every nerve screamed for rest. Midday brings more marching, more carrying, more digging, more waiting, and the monotony itself is torture, for boredom under threat is a special kind of suffering, where your mind races ahead into possibilities you cannot control. What if the next shell falls here? What if the next order sends you into the open? What if the next hour is your last, and this spiral eats away at clarity, leaving only fog? And in that fog, hallucinations sometimes crept in, shadows mistaken for soldiers, whispers mistaken for voices from home. And even the most rational men confessed later that they prayed, bargained, or spoke to ghosts just to endure the haze. But alongside the madness came moments of quiet beauty that seem almost blasphemous, like the way dawn light caught on frost crystals along a trench wall, or the way smoke curled from a cigarette shared between three men, or the sudden sound of laughter rolling like music over mud. And these flashes of humanity were reminders that survival was not just endurance, but the capacity to notice something still worth holding on to. Another strange fact emerges here. Soldiers in different armies often collected scraps of paper, old letters, or discarded books, not to read, but to use as insulation in boots, to stuff into coats, to line helmets, and yet sometimes in those scraps they found poems, prayers, or fragments of stories. And in reading them aloud around a dim lantern, men momentarily felt tethered to a wider world, to a culture and language larger than the narrow trench, and that tether mattered as much as any weapon. By afternoon, the body has become a machine running on fumes, and you discover that endurance in war was less about muscle than about surrendering to rhythm, about walking simply because the man in front of you walked, about digging because someone handed you a shovel, about eating because food was placed in your hand. And in this automation, you realize you have ceased being fully yourself. You have become a cog in a living machine, grinding through mud and smoke. And whether you last 24 hours depends not on heroic acts, but on whether you can allow yourself to dissolve into that machinery without protest, to silence the part of your mind that still longs for comfort and softness. Dusk creeps in, painting the world in gray shadows, and with it another round of tension, because night is the great thief, stealing certainty, replacing clear sight lines with shifting silhouettes, replacing distance with intimacy, bringing enemy. Patrols so close you can hear them cough, smell their sweat, feel the vibration of their boots through the soil. And the silence between these encounters is worse than the encounters themselves, because imagination fills it with horrors larger than reality. In the night, men developed peculiar habits. Some chewed coffee grounds straight from ration packs to stay awake. Some tied string to their rifles and looped it around their wrists so they would not drop the weapon in sleep. Some muttered the same prayer over and over like a broken record, and others simply stared into the dark until the eyes themselves invented light, sparks and patterns floating in vision like hallucinations mistaken for stars. And you realize here that survival was as much about tricking the senses as about resisting the enemy. When flares erupt again, painting the land in harsh silver, you throw yourself down, your breath shallow, ears straining, and in that moment, you feel both exposed and invisible, both target and survivor, and the duality tears at your mind, leaving you trembling long after silence returns. The cycle continues, hour by hour, and though you may imagine that dawn would bring relief, dawn only resets the ordeal. Another loop of hunger, fatigue, cold, waiting, and sudden terror. And you now understand why you would not last 24 hours, not because you lack courage, but because courage itself was never enough. Because survival required the surrender of self, the reshaping of body and mind into something that can endure the unendurable. And yet, as you lie safe in your own bed, listening to this, perhaps eyes half closed, let the curiosity of how men kept going, how they created tiny islands of meaning in seas of chaos, draw you softly toward part 6, where the deeper psychology of endurance in World War II waits to be uncovered. The 6th passage of this imagined ordeal unfolds not with triumph, but with the dawning recognition that war was less a series of battles and more a prolonged negotiation with suffering, a conversation with discomfort that never ended. And as you step again into the rhythm of these 24 hours, you begin to see that endurance was not just about pushing through, but about reshaping perception itself, about teaching the mind to interpret misery as normal. And that is perhaps the cruelest lesson of all, because the longer you survive, the less human you feel, until even joy seems suspect, a rare guest you cannot fully trust. The morning is cold again, dew settling on ruined helmets and rusted wire, the sky a pale canvas streaked with faint smoke from distant fires. And you rise stiffly, your body already aching, though you have barely begun the day, because pain here is cumulative, layered like sediment, each sleepless night an empty stomach building upon the last, and you feel it in your bones, in your spine, in the relentless pounding behind your temples, and you wonder how any man could keep moving through such heaviness. Breakfast, if it arrives, is no feast, just a tin of porridge clumped into paste, or a biscuit so dry you must sip water with every bite to swallow. And yet these scraps are eaten gratefully, because the stomach does not care about flavor, only fuel. And soldiers often joked that hunger made everything taste like home cooking, though behind the laughter was the knowledge that malnutrition gnawed at them daily, ribs showing through uniforms, faces thinning into hollows. And here another odd fact emerges. Many carried small stashes of sugar, chocolate, or even dried fruit in their packs, not just for nutrition, but as morale boosters, eaten slowly, piece by piece, in moments of despair, because sweetness itself became a form of medicine, a reminder that not all sensations were bitter. And this reliance on tiny comforts reveals just how fragile endurance was, balanced on crumbs and sips. But even with these small rituals, the hours stretch unbearably, and you are reminded again of the endless labor that defined soldiering, digging, hauling, cleaning weapons, carrying stretchers, tasks that broke down the body long before the enemy fired a shot. And these chores, though monotonous, were necessary, because a dirty rifle might jam, a weak trench wall might collapse, and neglect could be as deadly as bullets. Yet in the midst of such drudgery, peculiar forms of creativity emerged. Soldiers carving figures from bullet casings, fashioning playing cards from scraps of cardboard, even building miniature theaters with puppets cut from rags. And though crude, these inventions were lifelines, ways of insisting that imagination had not yet been extinguished by war. Midday heat or cold presses down, depending on the theater, and whether you are sweating under a blazing sun in North Africa or shivering in snow on the Eastern Front, discomfort is constant, the environment itself an adversary, and in both extremes, thirst becomes an enemy, for water supplies were often scarce, carried in dented canteens filled from questionable sources, and many soldiers spoke of thirst as a torment worse than hunger, tongues swelling, lips cracking, minds fogging, and in desperation, some resorted to drinking rain caught in helmets or melting snow with body heat, tiny sips that barely quenched but kept the body moving. And as you march again, boots dragging, rifle rubbing raw spots on your shoulder, you pass landscapes scarred beyond recognition, villages reduced to rubble, churches hollowed out, fields once golden now strewn with twisted metal, and it is. Here you realize that war was not just about soldiers, but about civilians whose lives were erased overnight, families scattered, children orphaned, homes abandoned, and you carry this knowledge like a hidden weight, heavier than your pack, because survival is not just physical but moral, and the images of the displaced haunt you, even as you try to focus on your own endurance. By late afternoon, exhaustion dulls the senses, and hallucinations creep in again. Branches sway like figures, clouds morph into faces, shadows move independently of their sources, and some men confessed later that they felt as though they were walking inside a dream they could not wake from. And perhaps you too would feel that slippage, the blurring of real and unreal, as if the very fabric of your perception had frayed. Evening draws near, and with it the gnawing fear of another night, because night means watch duty, patrols, the constant threat of ambush, the terror of being taken in darkness. And soldiers developed coping rituals here too, humming lullabies from childhood, reciting prayers, even inventing stories to tell each other in whispers as they waited, stories of futures they would never see, of families they longed to return to, of streets they hoped still stood. And these whispered tales became a form of resistance, a way of holding on to humanity when everything else was stripped away. But night also brings fresh horrors, the sudden burst of artillery, the sweeping glare of searchlights, the mechanical drone of aircraft overhead, and each intrusion resets fear, flooding the body with adrenaline it cannot spare, leaving nerves frayed, hands trembling, breath shallow, and though you survive the moment, you are left weaker, each surge of terror stealing something permanent from your reserves. As you lie prone in mud, staring into shadows, you feel the weight of it all pressing down. The hunger, the thirst, the filth, the silence, the uncertainty, and you realize again why you would not last 24 hours. Not because you would be shot, but because you would be worn down, eroded, dissolved by attrition, until the idea of moving forward feels impossible. And yet, despite all this, soldiers endured, not because they were stronger, but because they learned to lean into rhythm, to find fragments of humanity and scraps of food in jokes whispered under breath, in the warmth of another body beside them. In the dark, and these fragments were enough to carry them through, enough to make survival possible even when everything else screamed impossible. And as you drift now in your safe room, eyes heavy, let the curiosity of how endurance became ritual, how men transformed despair into routine, how the smallest gestures kept entire battalions from collapsing, guide you softly toward Part 7, where the deeper secrets of resilience, both physical and spiritual, begin to unfold. The seventh stretch of this imagined 24 hours reveals not explosions or victories, but the slow unraveling of human endurance. Because by now, the body has been awake too long, has been hungry too long, has been cold and damp and pressed by fear too long. And when morning comes again, it does not feel like a beginning, but a continuation of the same gray cycle, as though time itself has lost meaning, blending hours into one endless thread of waiting, working, and watching. The dawn is pale, the ground glistening with frost or dew, boots squelching in mud that never dries, and the air smells of smoke, sweat, and earth, a mixture that clings to every breath until it becomes the atmosphere of survival itself. You rise with aching limbs, scratch at lice crawling across seams of your uniform, rub your swollen feet to coax them into stiff boots, and swallow whatever ration is given, perhaps a biscuit so stale you must dunk it in thin coffee to soften it, or a tin of gray meat that tastes metallic, and though it offers no comfort, you chew because hunger insists, because to refuse would weaken you further, and weakness is not permitted. As the day begins, another round of chores arrives, endless in their repetition. Dig here, carry there, clean this, repair that, every task mundane yet critical, and soldiers discovered that focusing on such chores was a way of blunting fear. Because while your hands are busy, your mind cannot as easily wander into the terror of what may come. And this reveals one of war's stranger truths, that monotony itself became a form of medicine, dulling the edge of panic by wrapping it in routine. Yet monotony also created its own madness, for the sameness of tasks, the sameness of landscape, the sameness of waiting stretched perception thin, so that small changes, a bird flying overhead, a cloud shifting shape, a new sound in the distance took on enormous weight, sometimes mistaken for omens, sometimes treated as jokes, sometimes written into superstition, because in a world where control was gone, meaning was invented wherever it could be found. Midday drags under a weary sun, sweat soaking into collars, dirt grinding into skin, and thirst rising again, and men shared canteens sparingly, passing them like sacred chalices, each sip measured, each swallow accompanied by jokes about wine. Cellars and taverns, humor disguising desperation. But thirst is unforgiving, and some risked drinking from puddles or ditches, knowing disease lurked, but choosing sickness tomorrow over thirst today. And this is why survival was never guaranteed, because the body conspires against itself, demanding what the world cannot safely give. As you march again along ruined roads, you pass wreckage that tells its own stories. Carts shattered and left behind, helmets scattered, rifles rusting in ditches, shoes without owners, all of it whispering that others have walked here before and did not walk out. And those whispers carve into your thoughts until you begin to wonder whether you too are only passing through briefly, another set of footprints soon to fade. Yet even here, soldiers found ways to resist despair, whistling tunes, telling tall tales, inventing absurd rumors. One man might claim that the war would end tomorrow because a general's astrologer had predicted it, another that a shipment of real coffee was on the way, another that leave papers were being issued at random. And though everyone knew these were lies, they laughed and repeated them anyway, because lies that offered hope were more nourishing than truths that offered none. Afternoon brings labor again, shovels in hand, blisters reopening, dirt crumbling between fingers, and men cursed the earth itself for resisting, cursed the weather, cursed the endless digging that never seemed to end, but they kept digging, because a deeper trench might be the difference between life and death when shells fell, and this knowledge drove them harder than any officer's order. But evening creeps in, shadows stretching, birds going silent, and fear rises like a tide, for night is coming again, and night means another round of watching, another stretch of silence thick enough to suffocate, another endless wait punctuated by sudden terrors. In these hours, soldiers clung to each other, huddling close for warmth, whispering stories, passing cigarettes until only a glowing stub remained. And this closeness mattered because it reminded them they were not entirely alone, because touch and breath and shared silence built fragile walls against despair. But even in this, strangeness crept in. Some men confessed later that they dreamed while awake, that they saw family members standing at the edges of trenches, that they heard songs carried on the wind, that they believed for moments they were somewhere else entirely. And though such visions were symptoms of exhaustion, they also offered solace, illusions that softened the edges of misery. And sometimes illusions were enough. Night descends fully, and with it comes another barrage, sudden, violent, shaking the ground, fire tearing the sky open, ears ringing, hearts pounding, and when it ends, the silence is worse than the noise, heavy, absolute, pressing down like a weight, and you lie there trembling, realizing again that survival is not about grand courage, but about enduring this relentless cycle without breaking. And as you drift in your own bed, safe and quiet, you see why 24 hours in World War II would likely defeat you, not because of bullets, but because of attrition, because of the 1,000 small cuts of discomfort and fear. And yet you also see how men clung to rituals, humor, superstition, and each other to push beyond what seemed possible. And with that thought, let your curiosity soften into sleep, guiding you gently toward Part 8, where the hidden rituals of resilience and the fragile bonds of brotherhood in war will quietly unfold. The 8th stretch of this long imagined day opens with the revelation that what finally unravels a soldier is not always the noise of battle, but the weight of silence between the noise. Because after a night of half-sleep and sudden terror, the morning light does not bring relief so much as a dull ache, a heaviness in the body and in the spirit, as though every limb had been carved from stone, and the simple act of lifting your rifle feels monumental. The sun, when it appears, shines weakly through haze, its light falling on ruined fields scattered with scraps of uniforms, broken helmets, and the bent skeletons of wagons. Reminders that survival is temporary, that the ground itself is layered with endings, and you carry that awareness like a shadow. Breakfast is meager again, perhaps a ladle of thin gruel or a sliver of bread shared among 3. And soldiers sometimes stretch the illusion of fullness by sipping hot water slowly, closing their eyes and pretending it was broth, a trick of imagination more important than the taste. And this small detail shows why you might not last, because survival here was not simply about eating, but about convincing the mind to believe in satisfaction where there was none. By mid-morning, you are given another task, perhaps hauling ammunition across a stretch of open ground, each box heavy, each step sinking in mud, and the fear that a sniper might watch from the tree line makes your every movement stiff, careful, and agonizingly slow, until even breathing feels like risk. And this tension builds until your muscles quiver from holding themselves too tightly. But amid the strain there are peculiar, almost tender rituals. Men whistled to steady their nerves. Others recited lines of songs or prayers, and some even cracked quiet jokes about what they would do with the heavy crates if they made it home. Absurd jokes that no one believed, but everyone cherished for their defiance. The hours stretch further into fatigue, and you discover that waiting is its own weapon, that the mind begins to rebel against monotony, turning the smallest irritations into unbearable torments, like the constant itching of lice, the gnawing of rats that chew on boots at night, or the drips of water leaking into dugouts until the floor becomes a shallow swamp. And these irritations drive men to mutter curses or invent elaborate superstitions, blaming bad luck on the way a helmet was set down, or on an unlucky word spoken aloud. And though irrational, such beliefs gave a fragile sense of control in a world where control had vanished. By midday, the air grows hotter or colder, depending on the front, but always hostile. And thirst gnaws again. Canteens nearly empty, men passing them with careful sips, some daring to drink from ditches, despite the risk of dysentery. And you realize, thirst alone could undo you, because no amount of courage quenches a dry mouth, and no soldier's pride keeps lips from cracking into blood. Yet even in this misery, small moments of beauty break through, like the way sunlight glints on frost, or the way a bird dares to sing above the ruins, or the rare kindness of a soldier sharing a crumb of chocolate from home. And these fleeting sparks matter more than strategy or orders, because they remind the soul why it still clings to life. Afternoon brings more marching, boots slapping rhythmically, packs biting shoulders, and as you move, you pass villages reduced to hollow shells, doors swinging open on rusted hinges, pots still sitting on broken stoves, photographs scattered. In the dirt, and the absence of voices in these places feels louder than any gunfire, and you feel the chill of knowing that war devours not just armies, but entire communities, leaving silence where laughter once lived. Soldiers noticed these absences too, and some carried away trinket spoons, coins, fragments of mirrors, not as trophies, but as talismans, tokens to remind themselves that life had existed here once, and perhaps would again, and these objects held meaning far greater than their material value. By late afternoon, exhaustion presses once more, men trudging automatically, steps falling in rhythm with one another, their individuality dissolving into a moving mass. And you realize survival required this surrender, the willingness to move, like a machine, to let willpower be replaced by momentum. And this surrender, though practical, corrodes the spirit, making each man less himself and more a shadow of duty. Evening comes, and with it, the rising tension of another night. Soldiers preparing not for sleep, but for another vigil, arranging themselves in trenches, rifles close, eyes straining at shadows, ears tuned to the faintest sound, and in these hours men clung to ritual. One might light a cigarette and let the glow calm his nerves. Another might whisper the same phrase over and over like a spell. Another might polish his rifle with obsessive care. And these gestures, though trivial, gave a rhythm to fear, gave shape to the formless night. But night is always cruel, and soon it erupts with sudden chaos. Flares burst, searchlights sweep, artillery booms in the distance, and the air is filled with the scream of shells, the ground shaking beneath you. And though the barrage may not hit your exact position, the sheer violence of the sound frays your nerves, leaves your hands trembling, your breath shallow, and when it passes, the silence afterward feels unbearable. A silence so deep it presses against your chest, reminding you that this cycle will repeat endlessly. And here lies the truth of why you might not last 24 hours. Because the war demands not just strength of body, but surrender of soul. Demands you give up comfort, give up certainty, give up even the idea of safety, and yet still keep moving, still keep breathing, still keep watching the horizon for another dawn. And as you lie in your safe bed, drifting now toward sleep, you carry the faint echo of those men who endured, who found meaning in crumbs, humor in suffering, and hope in the smallest rituals. And with that echo, let your curiosity pull you softly toward Part 9, where the fragile brotherhood of survival and the strange ways men kept each other alive will slowly unfold. The ninth passage of this imagined 24 hours does not begin with courage or action, but with the slow, aching weight of bodies that have been ground down past endurance. Because by now, the war has stripped away illusions and left only the bare mechanics of survival. And you see that lasting through this stretch requires more than discipline, more than orders. It requires something quieter and stranger, the fragile bonds between men, the invisible threads of brotherhood that kept soldiers upright when their own strength had run out, threads woven not by speeches or flags, but by the simple fact of suffering together, shoulder to shoulder, hour after hour. The morning light filters weakly through mist, and in that pale illumination, you notice the faces around you, gaunt, hollow-eyed, smeared with dirt, yet softened by familiarity, because these faces are now the only world, you know, companions, who share the same lice, the same mud, the same hunger, and who, in their presence, make the unbearable just a little less sharp. You chew a ration of stale bread, each bite a struggle, but when the man beside you slides over half his own crust without a word, you realize that survival is often communal, that generosity persists even where abundance is gone. And this is a truth often hidden in war stories, that the quiet sharing of food, the silent passing of water, the whispered joke in the dark mattered as much as strategy or weapons. By mid-morning, the day's work begins again, and though your body aches with every step, you follow because the group moves, because isolation is more dangerous than exhaustion. And this is why men rarely broke down entirely when they had comrades, because despair, when divided, became bearable. Tasks pile up hauling crates, digging trenches, repairing boots with scraps of wire, and though meaningless on their own, they take shape when done together, voices rising in muttered complaints, laughter sparking unexpectedly at the absurdity of endless mud, and these shared rhythms formed a strange kind of music, a chorus of survival humming through every motion. Yet even in this fragile unity, there are cracks, because tempers fray, patience thins, and arguments flare over rations or orders, harsh words cutting deeply in the close quarters of trenches, but almost as quickly apologies or silence follow, because everyone knows that division is deadly, that anger cannot be afforded when survival rests on trust. And here emerges another strange detail, that men often invented rituals of camaraderie, like passing around a single cigarette until it burned fingers, or carving initials into trench walls, or creating nicknames for each other that became shields against despair, names that reduced fear into something small enough to laugh at. And these gestures, though trivial, stitched men into something larger than themselves. The afternoon drags long, and as you march with others, boots thudding in rhythm, you sense how identity dissolves into the group, how steps synchronize unconsciously, how breaths rise and fall together, and this collective rhythm carries you forward when your own body threatens collapse. And it is here you see why you might not last alone, because endurance in war was rarely solitary. It was carried by groups, by friendships, by bonds forged in mud and smoke. Thirst rises again, and a canteen is passed hand to hand, each man taking only a sip, though his throat screams for more. Each sip a gesture of restraint, of trust, and this act, though small, becomes enormous in its significance, because it proves that brotherhood mattered even when survival was at stake. But alongside generosity came superstition, and many soldiers swore that survival depended on sticking close to certain comrades, that some men carried a luck that shielded those near them, and so squads clustered instinctively, following not logic but belief, and these beliefs, irrational as they were, gave men courage to keep walking into uncertainty. Evening arrives, and with it another round of tension, the horizon darkening, shadows stretching, and soldiers draw closer together, huddling for warmth, for reassurance, for the illusion of safety. And in those circles stories, flow stories, of home, of mothers cooking, of wives waiting, of children imagined. Stories told and retold until they became incantations, words shaping memory into shield, and these spoken fragments of civilian life reminded men that they were not just soldiers, but humans still tethered to worlds beyond the front, and holding on to that tether gave them reason to rise again tomorrow. But night is cruel, and soon shatters with gunfire, sudden and violent, flares lighting the sky, explosions tearing the silence apart, and in that chaos, the bonds of brotherhood are tested, men reaching for each other in the dark, dragging the wounded back, shielding comrades with their own bodies. And though fear is overwhelming, the instinct to protect one another proves stronger than the instinct to flee. And this truth echoes in countless accounts of men who survived not because of their own strength, but because someone beside them refused to let them fall. When silence returns after the barrage, you are left trembling, ears ringing. But you glance at the faces near you and feel a flicker of something beyond terror: gratitude, connection, a recognition that survival is not yours alone but shared. And this flicker is enough to keep despair at bay. And as you lie in your own safe bed, perhaps drifting now towards sleep, you realize why you might not last 24 hours, not because you lack bravery, but because you have not yet lived inside this web of fragile dependence, this communion of suffering that both crushed and sustained. And it is this paradox, the loneliness of war intertwined with its brotherhood, that carried men through. A paradox that will continue unfolding softly in Part 10, where the deeper secrets of loyalty, sacrifice, and the fragile thread of trust that held soldiers together will quietly emerge. The 10th movement of this imagined 24 hours begins with a truth that many veterans confessed quietly years later. That war was less about winning battles than about keeping promises whispered in foxholes, promises muttered over shared cigarettes, promises made silently when one soldier glanced at another in the darkness and knew that survival depended on loyalty stronger than fear. And you see now that to last even a day required you not only to fight hunger and exhaustion, but to carry the invisible burden of trust, because trust was both a weapon and a shield, and without it the long night and the longer day would consume you. The dawn, when it comes, feels hollow, its weak light spreading across a landscape shattered into jagged silhouettes. Trees blackened, barns collapsed, fields scarred into mud-scrawled canvases. And as you step forward with your comrades, weight of the rifle in your hand feels heavier, not because of its steel, but because of what it represents. The expectation that you will not falter, that you will stand your ground, so that the man beside you can sleep or eat or simply breathe without fear. Breakfast again is little more than scraps. Maybe a biscuit softened in tepid coffee substitute. Maybe a spoonful of stew that tastes of tin, and you choke it down because hunger leaves no choice. And yet, in the midst of this meagerness, one man pushes a small portion of his own ration toward you with a shrug. And though you protest, he insists, and that small act imprints itself deeper than any speech. Because in war, generosity was worth more than medals. It was the glue of survival. By mid-morning, orders come to move again, and as boots squelch in mud, as packs bite shoulders, as rifles knock against ribs, you fall into the rhythm of the column. Dozens of men moving like a single living machine, and in that rhythm lies safety. For to march alone is death, but to march together creates an illusion of invincibility, a collective heartbeat that pushes you forward when your own would falter. Yet the road is lined with reminders of fragility: helmets half buried in mud, rifles snapped in half, letters fluttering from corpses whose hands will never deliver them. And you pass these without stopping, because to stop is to collapse. But you carry their images anyway, tucked into the corners of your mind, haunting you in moments of quiet. And here another truth emerges, that loyalty in war was not grand or ceremonial, but practical, forged in the mud, proven in the small acts of watching each other's backs, of waking a comrade when his head droops dangerously on guard duty, of dragging him forward when his boots stick in the muck, of sharing sips of water from nearly empty canteens. And though such gestures seem ordinary, they were lifelines, and without them no one lasted. Midday arrives with chores again, endless and repetitive: digging trenches deeper, reinforcing walls with planks, cleaning weapons until hands ache. And while the work feels futile, you realize that obedience to these routines is itself an act of loyalty, a way of proving to your unit that you will do your part, that you will not endanger them by neglecting what must be done. And though fatigue gnaws, though blisters sting, you keep shoveling because the man next to you shovels, because abandoning the task would betray more than the earth. It would betray trust. Afternoon presses with thirst and heat, or cold and hunger, depending on the front, and men begin to stumble. But here again, loyalty shows its quiet face, as one steadies another with a hand on the arm, as one jokes about the officer's voice. To lighten the mood, as one hums a tune from home, that slowly others join in, their broken voices rising together, not as music, but as affirmation that they still exist, that they still belong, and belonging becomes a form of survival as necessary, as food. Yet trust is fragile, and moments come when it is tested brutally, when orders demand a patrol across open ground, when a man falters and another must decide whether to risk his life pulling him back, when silence demands stillness, but instinct screams to flee, and it is in these crucibles that the bond proves itself. For more often than not, men did risk themselves, dragging the wounded, shielding comrades, ignoring their own fear. And though not every story ended in rescue, the attempt mattered. The attempt reinforced the bond. The attempt reminded survivors that loyalty still existed in a world designed to erase it. Evening comes again, the shadows stretching, fear sharpening as night approaches, and soldiers huddle closer, voices lower, cigarettes glow faintly in cupped hands, and stories flow once more, stories of families, of futures, of absurd hopes. Like opening a bakery or owning a farm after the war. And though such dreams sound fragile against the rumble of distant artillery, they are spoken with conviction, because sharing them creates a pact. If we survive, we will live again, we will laugh again, we will be more than shadows and mud, and such promises, fragile as breath, bound men tighter than any oath. Night falls, and with it, the tension of another watch, another patrol, another endless silence broken by sudden flares and crackling fire. And in that darkness, loyalty is tested yet again, because to stay awake, to whisper warnings, to keep a comrade from dozing, is to hold his life in your hands. And when morning finally returns, when the sky grays and the cycle threatens to repeat, you understand that you might not last 24 hours, not because you would collapse physically, but because you have never had to carry the invisible burden of being someone else's lifeline, of knowing that their breath depends on your endurance. And this weight, heavier than rifles or packs, breaks those unprepared for it. And yet, as you drift safe in your bed, eyes heavy, you also sense the quiet dignity of this bond, the fragile beauty of loyalty amid chaos. And with that thought, you let your curiosity soften into the next part 11, where the cost of such loyalty, the sacrifices demanded and the grief endured, will slowly reveal themselves in the gentle rhythm of memory. The 11th stretch of this imagined day begins with the cruel realization that loyalty, which once seemed like a shield, carries its own unbearable cost, because to promise survival together also means to witness loss together. And by now the fragile brotherhood that carried you through mud and silence is tested by grief. Grief that comes suddenly and without mercy, when a shell falls too close, or a sniper's bullet cracks the air, or sickness steals a man who had only yesterday been laughing beside you. And in these moments the war reveals why you might not last, not because you would lack courage to fight, but because you would lack the resilience to keep going while carrying ghosts beside you. The morning begins with gray light spilling across trenches, boots sliding on slick clay, hands raw from digging, and you notice the empty space where one man should be, a space heavier than any weight you carry, because absence itself becomes presence, filling every glance, every pause in conversation. And soldiers adapt, not with speeches, but with silence. Silence so thick it presses against the ribs. And in that silence they continue working, eating, marching, because the war does not pause for grief, And this refusal of time to mourn is perhaps the sharpest wound of all. Breakfast, if it arrives, tastes even hollower than usual. Bread chewed mechanically, broth swallowed without thought, because every bite feels stolen from someone who will never eat again. And though no one says it aloud, every man knows it. By mid-morning the tasks resume, crates carried, trenches dug deeper, weapons cleaned until hands blister, and all of it feels surreal, because grief and routine exist side by side. One hand burying a comrade in shallow earth, the other hand polishing a rifle. And this duality, this constant shift between loss and labor, unravels the spirit slowly, because it teaches you to swallow sorrow without expression, to fold it into the rhythm of work until it becomes indistinguishable from exhaustion. Afternoon comes, and with it the march, boots slapping in rhythm, and as you move you notice small tokens of memory, someone clutching a photograph more tightly than before, someone humming a tune he once shared with the dead man, someone muttering a name under his breath as though it were a prayer. And you see how remembrance becomes ritual, how grief becomes an invisible companion carried on backs already bowed by hunger and fatigue. Yet even here humor persists, brittle but vital. Men joking about how the lost comrade would laugh at them for stumbling, or how he would complain about the stew they choked down. And this laughter, though cracked, becomes a shield, a way of softening grief into something survivable. And you realize how strange it is that humor and mourning walk hand in hand in war, both necessary, both incomplete. Evening drags heavy, the light dimming, and fear rises again as night approaches. But grief does not vanish, it sharpens, because the absence is louder in darkness. When whispers carry, when silences stretch, and soldiers find themselves speaking to the dead under their breath, asking for protection, swearing vengeance, or simply confessing fears they cannot share with the living. And though strange, this practice reveals how grief reshaped survival, turning memory into companion, ghost into guard. Night erupts again with violence, flares burning the sky, shells shaking the ground, rifles snapping, and in the chaos another comrade falls. And though your instinct is to freeze, loyalty drives you to drag him back, to press hands against wounds, to shout for help, and even if he dies in your arms, the act itself binds you to those still alive, proving again that survival is not individual but collective, bought at the price of sacrifice and grief. When silence finally returns, the night feels heavier than ever, your body trembling, your heart hollowed, and you understand more deeply why you might not last, not because you could not endure hunger or cold, but because you could not carry grief without collapse, could not march another step while the weight of absence pressed on your shoulders. And yet soldiers did, because there was no choice, because to stop was to die, and so they walked forward with ghosts in their ranks, with silence in their mouths, with tears swallowed into mud. And as you lie in your safe bed, drifting into the soft rhythm of sleep, you feel the echo of that truth. That war was not only fought with rifles, but with memory, with loyalty bound to loss, and that to endure 24 hours meant to keep. Walking with grief as your constant companion. And with that recognition, let your curiosity carry you gently toward Part 12, where the long shadow of sacrifice and the strange ways men made peace with loss will unfold quietly in the darkness. The 12th passage of this long imagined day begins not with noise, but with the slow settling of silence, a silence that is not peaceful but weighted, because by now you have carried hunger, exhaustion, and grief long enough to realize that the true cost of war is not measured in battles, but in the way men are asked to keep moving after each loss, as though time itself were indifferent, as though mud and orders and routine swallowed sorrow whole and demanded the body rise anyway. And this is where you might falter, because lasting 24 hours means learning how to walk with absence, how to fold sacrifice into your breath until it becomes as ordinary as hunger, and that is a skill forged only by desperation. Morning comes with pale light spreading over frost, uniforms stiff with damp, hands swollen and cracked, and yet the first task is always the same line-up. Eat what little there is. Drink from canteens that are half empty already. And then march or dig or carry. And this rhythm, monotonous yet relentless, is how men stitched themselves together after grief, because work gave sorrow a place to hide. Labor pressed against despair until it dulled into background ache. Breakfast is meager again, perhaps thin porridge or coffee substitute that tastes of burnt chicory. And yet, in this bleakness, someone produces a crust of bread saved from yesterday, breaks it in half, and presses it into another's hand. And this quiet act of giving is as sacred as a ritual, because in war sacrifice did not end with death. It lived in the living, in the willingness to part with the little they had to ease another's suffering. By mid-morning, the orders arrive: dig here, carry there, reinforce this trench, and though bodies ache and spirits sag, the work begins, shovels biting into soil, boots slipping in muck, shoulders bent under weight, and it is here you see how sacrifice became routine. Not grand gestures, but small acts repeated endlessly. A man taking the heavier load, another offering to stand watch longer so a comrade might rest, another giving up his last cigarette to soothe nerves before a patrol. And each of these sacrifices, though minor, added up to survival. Survival not of individuals, but of groups bound together by shared pain. Afternoon stretches into heat or cold, and thirst gnaws again, lips splitting, tongues swollen. But instead of draining canteens selfishly, men rationed carefully, taking sips and passing the vessel along. And this restraint, this denial of self, for the sake of others, is the essence of wartime sacrifice. And you realize how foreign it feels compared to the comfort of your own life, and how difficult it would be to deny your body what it craves in order to preserve the group. And this is another reason you might not last. By late afternoon, fatigue presses so hard that hallucinations creep again, shapes shifting in the corner of vision, whispers carried on wind mistaken for voices. And here too sacrifice plays its role, as one man shakes another awake, refusing to let him drift into dangerous sleep, as another shares a handful of sugar crystals saved for weeks to keep morale from cracking. And these gestures, tiny in the grand sweep of war, carried enormous weight for those living them. Evening arrives, shadows deepening, and with them the knowledge that another night of fear waits, another stretch of silence punctuated by sudden eruptions of violence, and men prepare by cleaning weapons, by murmuring prayers, by clutching tokens of luck. And in these preparations, you see the quiet ways they sacrificed peace of mind for vigilance, because staying awake, staying alert, staying ready meant denying the body the comfort it screamed for, and every hour awake was an offering, laid down to the altar of survival. Night comes, and with it, the rumble of artillery, the whine of shells, the flare of explosions, lighting the landscape in silver and shadow. And in the chaos, you see men shielding comrades, dragging wounded through mud, carrying bodies heavier than their own strength should allow. And though some live and some die, the instinct to protect one another burns brighter than fear, proving again that survival was less about courage and isolation, and more about the willingness to sacrifice self for others. When the barrage ends and silence presses heavy, men sit trembling, breath shallow, hands shaking, and yet they whisper to each other words of reassurance, of grim humor, of promises that tomorrow they will endure again. And these whispers, too, are sacrifices, offerings of comfort given when none is truly felt. Because to speak courage aloud is to lend it away even if you have none for yourself. And here lies another truth of why you might not last, because sacrifice is not an occasional test, but a constant demand, woven into every sip of water, every shared crust, every sleepless hour. every hand that pulls another forward, and without it survival collapses. Yet as you lie in your own safe bed, perhaps drifting now, you feel the echo of that sacrifice. The way it bound strangers together into something resembling family, the way it turned misery into shared endurance. And you understand why this rhythm of giving and losing, of surrendering self for the group, was the only path through 24 hours. And with that recognition, let your curiosity guide you softly toward part 13, where the fragile balance between sacrifice and despair and the strange rituals men, created to preserve meaning, will slowly reveal themselves. The 13th stretch of this imagined 24 hours begins with the uneasy truth that sacrifice, though necessary, could not sustain the soul by itself, and so men invented rituals, improvised meanings, and clung to fragments of imagination to preserve some sense of humanity in a world intent on stripping it away. Because without meaning, despair would devour them faster than hunger, and this is why you might not last, because the mind, no less than the body, must be fed. And in war, the diet of the mind was thin, so soldiers learned to stretch scraps of memory and invention into banquets of survival. Morning creeps in with gray light, spilling across trenches slick with mud, boots sliding as men rise stiffly, hands chapped and raw, eyes bloodshot from fractured rest. And yet there is a strange rhythm in the way they line up, in the way rations are passed, and the way each man nods silently at the next, a rhythm that becomes almost religious, a ritual of endurance repeated daily until it feels like liturgy. Breakfast is sparse again, perhaps a biscuit dunked in lukewarm coffee substitute, perhaps a ladle of broth with barely a shred of meat, but as it is eaten, men speak of feasts remembered, describing roasted chickens, loaves of fresh bread, stews thick with vegetables. And though the food is not there, the act of describing it nourishes something else. And this shared imagination becomes ritual, a way of tasting what hunger has stolen. By mid-morning work resumes, digging, hauling, carrying, and though the body aches, men hum songs under their breath, or mutter poems remembered from school, or recite prayers in languages from home. And these words, repeated over and over, become anchors, grounding them when the world feels like it is dissolving. Some carried talismans, photographs, medallions, scraps of cloth, and rubbed them between fingers like rosaries, whispering to them as if they held power. And others carved initials into trench walls, into rifle stocks, into helmets, believing that inscribing themselves into the material world might protect them from vanishing entirely. And these acts, though small, became sacred, transforming ordinary objects into symbols of endurance. Afternoon drags on, the sun weak or the sky overcast, and tasks pile up again, but between them, men create games counting how many shells fall in an hour, inventing bets on when the next ration truck will arrive, mocking officers with elaborate impersonations whispered in corners. And this humor, fragile as glass, becomes another ritual, repeated not to entertain but to survive. Because laughter, even bitter laughter, proves the spirit has not yet broken. Yet beneath these rituals despair still lurks, waiting for cracks, and sometimes rituals turned obsessive. Men refusing to move unless a token was touched, or insisting on wearing the same socks for luck, or spitting 3 times before leaving a trench. And while these superstitions seem irrational, they offered control in a world where control was gone. And perhaps you too would invent such rituals, because without them, the vast randomness of death would be unbearable. By late afternoon, fatigue presses again, and rituals shift toward memory. Men telling stories of childhood, of holidays, of first loves, speaking them aloud not for entertainment, but for preservation, because to say them aloud was to keep them alive, to keep them from being erased by mud and noise. And these spoken memories became a chorus, each voice layering over the other, reminding them that beyond this misery, a larger life once existed and might again. Evening falls, and with it, tension rises. But rituals take on new urgency. Some clean their rifles with obsessive precision. Others fold blankets neatly, though they are damp and dirty. Others whisper the same prayer over and over until lips bleed. And these acts, repetitive and compulsive, are not for practicality alone, but for reassurance. Proof that something can still be controlled. Proof that some order still exists. Night comes, and with it fresh terror. Flares bursting, artillery rumbling, the air splitting with rifle fire. And in the chaos, men cling to their rituals more tightly than ever, kissing tokens before firing, whispering names of family with each shot, promising silently that they will live to see another dawn. And these promises, repeated in darkness, give the body strength it does not actually have, tricking it into one more hour, one more breath, one more step. When silence returns, heavy and suffocating, men whisper again, telling each other fragments of dreams, fragments of plans, fragments of hope. And in this whispering the rituals continue, weaving despair and endurance into a fragile net that holds them just above collapse. And here lies the truth of why you might not last, because without such rituals the emptiness would consume you, the monotony would rot the mind, the despair would hollow you until nothing remained, and unless you too could invent meaning from scraps, you would not endure. Yet as you drift safe in your bed, perhaps eyes half closed already, you see the strange beauty in this endurance, the way rituals, however small, transformed misery into survival. And with that recognition, let your curiosity carry you softly toward part 14, where the fragile line between ritual and madness, and the ways men walked it daily, will quietly unfold. The 14th stretch of this imagined 24 hours reveals the fragile line between ritual and madness. Because by now, the habits that once seemed like anchors begin to blur into compulsions, and you see that survival in war required not only physical strength and loyalty, but also a constant negotiation with sanity itself. And this is why you might not last, because the human mind, unaccustomed to such strain, begins to fracture in subtle ways when pressed by hunger, fear, grief, and repetition without end. The morning comes once again in gray silence, the ground soaked with dew, boots sliding in muck, uniforms stiff with sweat and damp, and yet every man moves automatically into routine, lining up, receiving rations, chewing without tasting, drinking without quenching, because to pause is to notice the emptiness, to notice the ghosts at the edges, and noticing too much is dangerous. Breakfast is little more than bread hardened into stone, or coffee so thin it tastes of ash. And men mutter jokes about how their mothers would weep to see them swallow such filth. And they laugh not because it is funny, but because laughter is the only barrier between routine and despair. By mid-morning tasks begin again, digging, carrying, cleaning, and here you notice how rituals morph into obsession. One man polishing his rifle until the metal gleams though mud will cover it within minutes. Another rearranging sandbags into perfect lines again and again. Another folding and unfolding a letter until it is nearly pulp. And you realize these actions are not practical, but psychological gestures to keep madness at bay. And yet, in their repetition, madness lurks, because too much attention to detail is itself a kind of unraveling. Afternoon presses with heat or cold, and thirst gnaws again. Men licking their cracked lips, staring at empty canteens, whispering to each other about water, as though speaking of it might summon it. And some begin to dream aloud about rivers, lakes, fountains back home, describing them in such detail that others nod and close their eyes, pretending they too are there. And this collective hallucination becomes ritual, a way of softening torment by reshaping it into story. Yet even in this fragile theater of the mind, cracks widen. Some men fall silent, staring into nothing, lips moving with words unheard. Others mutter curses at invisible foes, striking at shadows, and comrades gently restrain them, whispering. Reassurance, because everyone knows the mind can break at any time, and no one is immune. Evening arrives, and with it another march, boots thudding in rhythm, and you notice how rhythm itself becomes ritual, the thud of feet against earth, creating a hypnotic trance that pulls the body forward without conscious will. And this trance is both salvation and danger, because it dulls pain, but also erases self, turning men into shadows of movement, shells of identity. As the sun lowers, shadows stretch across ruined fields, barns collapsed into skeletal frames, trees splintered into grotesque sculptures, and men avoid looking too closely at these shapes, because the mind, already fragile, invents phantoms, sees figures where none exist, hears voices in the rustle of leaves, and so they keep eyes down, boots forward, muttering songs or prayers under breath as shields against illusion. Night comes, and with it another watch. Men crouched in trenches, rifles gripped in trembling hands, eyes straining into blackness. And here rituals become even sharper, some muttering the same phrase every 5 minutes, some clicking their teeth. In patterns, some drawing invisible crosses in the air. And these compulsions, though irrational, hold them together, because to abandon them would mean acknowledging the abyss yawning in silence. Then the eruption comes again, sudden flares, shells screaming, earth shaking, and in that chaos, madness, and survival are indistinguishable men, shouting nonsense as they fire, others laughing hysterically as dirt rains down, others whispering calmly as though reciting prayers. And when the barrage ends, the silence that follows is almost unbearable, pressing so heavily that you wonder how anyone could endure another second without breaking. And this is why you might not last 24 hours, because endurance here is not just about resisting hunger or cold, but about walking the thin wire between ritual and madness, about allowing the mind to fracture just enough to survive, but not so far that it shatters completely, a balance impossible to imagine from the safety of your bed. And yet, as you drift now in your own room, eyelids heavy, you feel the strange beauty in this endurance, the way imagination, superstition, humor, and ritual combined into fragile scaffolding that held men above despair. And with that recognition, let your curiosity guide you gently toward ending part, where the question of what happens when that scaffolding fails, when men slip fully into madness or discover strange new ways of seeing, will slowly unfold. And so the imagined day ends, not with victory, not with parades or speeches, but with the quiet collapse of another cycle, a cycle of hunger endured, of thirst half quenched, of fatigue pressed against bone, of grief swallowed silently, of rituals repeated like prayers, of laughter cracked but still alive, a brotherhood stitched together from scraps of generosity, of fear weathered through flares and silence. And as you look back across these 24 hours, you see clearly. Now why you would not have lasted, why most of us, raised in softer times, surrounded by comfort and certainty, would crumble not from bullets, but from the slow attrition of body and mind, from the endless erosion of sleep, of warmth, of hope. And yet you also see the strange beauty in how men endured, how they built resilience out of nothing, how they held on to each other when everything else was stripped away, how they invented rituals to tame despair, how they whispered memories into the night to keep humanity alive. And this realization is perhaps the quiet lesson of history, that endurance is not about heroism alone, but about the 1,000 small choices to keep walking, to keep breathing, to keep hoping even when nothing invites you to. And as you lie now in your bed, safe, warm, full, untouched by artillery or mud, you might close your eyes and feel a flicker of gratitude. Gratitude for the comfort that surrounds you. Gratitude for those who endured what you could not. Gratitude for the fragile thread of history that carried you here. And perhaps also a quiet promise to remember them, not with trumpets and banners, but with silence, with reflection, with a pause to honor what 24 hours in their world would have meant. And if your eyelids have grown heavy, if your breath has softened into rhythm, then let this story fade like the dimming of a lantern, leaving only calm behind, because perhaps your eyes are already closing, and the voices of the past are already dissolving into dream, carrying you toward rest. And before you drift fully away, I will ask only this: subscribe to our channel, so that tomorrow night, when the world is quiet again, you may return, and we may walk another forgotten path of history together, softly, slowly, until sleep claims you once more.